Well, thank you very much for coming to Who Teaches Rural Social Studies, a front porch conversation about demographics, belonging, and the racialized terrain of civic education. Um, Part of the reason why we're here is due to a couple of articles that are part of a larger set that we've done in the past. So we've been working with a couple of other colleagues as well around the NTPS survey data out of IES, National Teacher and Principal Survey, for quite a few years. And we've done a little bit of work. It's always been around social studies per se, um, and looking at the demographics and experience of social studies teachers through kind of quantitative data. We are going to be focusing, and we were asked to kind of join in on this on the summit because of a couple of papers that we've done just recently. The first, which is going to be the bulk of the session, is going to be Who Teaches Rural Social Studies, a National Portrait of Demographics, Belonging, and the Racialized Terrain of Social Studies Education. Which is the same title as the presentation. And then also we are also going to be talking about another article we did in a journal called Assert, which is much more a research to practice um, um, paper that is directed directly at teachers itself. And that was called A Portrait of Rural Social Studies Teachers and Their Students, Demographics and Implications for Professional Development. So it's those kind of two areas that we're going to be chatting about a little bit today.
Okay, so to start with, our context, like who are we and why are we, sharing this with you today? And really, the two articles that David mentioned that we're going to be talking about today come out of our experiences living and working in a rural space, and that's true for us at Virginia Tech. At Virginia Tech, it's located in a very rural setting, but it's also been true for our other experiences in school and in teaching. So I grew up going to a rural high school and my graduating class was 63 students, so a very intimate space in the country. And before moving to Virginia Tech, I also lived in a rural space in Blanchard, Oklahoma, which was a town with a population of about 6,000 people at the time. And then I know David also has experience teaching in rural settings.
Yeah, I taught in upstate New York, which was basically a rural area there, dealing with a great deal of poverty. And yeah, so that's where my rural background was in two middle schools, a high school and middle school up in upstate New York.
And so when we came to this data, when we learned that we had access to this data through Tom Williams, our colleague who can't be here today, we were really interested in looking specifically at the numbers for rural educators, but then within the social studies context. We really situate ourselves as social studies scholars, not experts in rural education. So for those of you on this call who are experts in rural education, sorry, maybe, because we are social studies scholars. But within the social studies space, we had seen a lot of researchers making assumptions in articles, but also in different spaces about who is teaching in the field at large. So an example that you see here on the screen at one of our national conferences a couple years ago. There was this statement in our call for proposals. The structural game has changed, but many of the conceptual players remain the same. And that made us really start thinking like, is that true? Has the structural game changed? Are we seeing something different in who is teaching social studies? And then from our background in rural ed, we wanted to say, is it different in rural ed? And so that was where these papers came from. We really wanted to look at where is the evidence out there about who is teaching social studies, and we couldn't find it. And then we have the data, so we thought we would write it. And our intention here is to build a bridge between what is happening in social studies and what's happening in rural research, because our experience, at least in writing these papers, has been that there's not a lot of research that's happening at that intersection. And when it is, a lot of times it is like research that's happening in a rural context, but that isn't necessarily one of the factors that's being considered in the research in the publication.
Yeah, because what happens, and I think Ariel, who I see on the uh, as in the participant list, who's a social studies person, often you'll see in a social studies journal, it'd be like social studies focused. They might say we're a Midwestern university or a rural university, but it's often very much the focus is on the social studies itself, and then very little detail or conceptual awareness is given to concepts around rurality and things like that.
So for this study, our research question was looking at the 2020 and 2021 National Teacher and Principal Survey data to answer these questions. Who are social studies teachers? And with that variable, we're really looking at more than just one factor. We're looking at race, gender, age, experience, and degree completion, things like that. And then what type of programs did they complete? Were they part of an alternative or a traditional certification program? And how satisfied are they with their employment? And actually in this study, we also look at the 2017-2018 data. So you'll see a little bit of comparison because we're also thinking about do we see these numbers shifting? So we'll get into that a little bit more. For the study, we used restricted use data under license from the Institute of Education Sciences. And then we analyzed the teacher data that we analyzed in the study was selected by a two-part process. So we're looking at both subject matter, and under the category for subject matter, we're thinking about teachers who are classified as social sciences, and then also social studies specifically, but then also individual areas, history, geography, economics, civics. And so this is based on teacher self-reporting. So some people might say they're social studies teachers while others report a specific silo within the discipline. But we're looking at all of them collectively and then the second variable that we're looking at is rurality. And so we're using IES's definition of what counts as rural, and we'll talk more about that in a second, to narrow down on the teachers who really identify as rural within this data set. Within this space, we really are looking at, we are using quantitative methodology, and we're doing that intentionally because we feel like quantitative large-scale data has the potential to be helpful at the complex intersection of social studies education and rural schools where little research has been historically conducted. And using it gives us the ability to provide these national portraits. And then we're also using it, and we say this a little bit tongue-in-cheek, some of the most important words in social studies, or especially in history education, where we do a lot of work, are sources and evidence. And what we were finding is people were making claims where sources and evidence didn't exist. We weren't able to provide any in terms of who's actually doing the teaching in social studies. And we felt like quantitative methodology would be able to give us that evidence to be able to use and cite in later work. And before we get into talking about the theory and the findings, we want to preface with just briefly talking a little bit about limitations, because we did get some pushback on some of this immediately, and especially from reviewers en route to publication that often said things like, well, this isn't my town. Like what you're describing doesn't describe the place in which I live. And that's really fair. Like rural context, every rural context in town is unique. And it's true that national data does not always include contextualized pictures of individual communities. And so we just want to acknowledge that from the forefront. But we also want to say, in this case, the findings from this study are not meant to provide individual snapshots. Instead, we're trying to zoom out and look at what's happening nationally and provide a portal through which to analyze national trends in rural settings. So while we acknowledge this data set can't capture every nuance, we do feel that it offers a crucial starting point and a point of connection with the limited literature on rural social studies. Okay, so then now we're going to jump into the study. As we are looking at this data, it'd be really easy, and I think is often the case, to just share the data, like here are the facts. But both David and I feel like data is not necessarily, no, not necessarily, data is not neutral. So whenever we're reporting it, we feel like there needs to be some kind of way that we're interpreting it. And we have chosen to do that guided by a layered theoretical framework that integrates critical demography and place attachment with critical place inquiry. And we're going to talk a little bit more about each of those on the next slides. This choice reflects the understanding that demographic patterns are not merely neutral or descriptive. Rather, they're products of historically situated power structures and spatial dynamics that determine and shape who becomes a social studies teacher. who remains in the profession, and how identity and belonging shape social studies education in rural schools. And all of those were pieces that were important to us. And so we intentionally engage alongside of these three ideas, we intentionally engage also with Longhurst's conceptualization of rurality as plural. And we're in that we're exploring how first rural, second rural, and rural plural appear in those different theoretical frameworks that we use. And then we also just want to say again that although it is informed by rural education research, it's really grounded in the disciplinary concerns of social studies education, and particularly the civic mission of social studies and how questions of representation, race, gender, and identity shape what gets taught in rural social studies classrooms. So the first lens, or the first thing that we sort of paired together, is this idea of critical demography as a structured rural sorting, and we paired that with the idea of first rural. So in this category, we're thinking about the ways that critical demography considers the relationship between demographic factors, including race, socioeconomic status, immigration, and educational outcomes. This helps us position rural social studies teacher identity as not merely a descriptive variable, but as a reflection of systemic inequality and educational gatekeeping. And it aligns with what Longhurst defines as first rural, which is the material and measurable aspects of rural life, including geographic isolation, low population density, and distance from urban centers. First rural really helps us reinforce an understanding of the ways that structural forces maintain demographic homogeneity in rural social studies teaching despite shifting student demographics. And then on this next slide, we have an image of representation of critical demography.
So yeah, so when we say, and the other thing is with critical demography, one of the things that happened is, and we often talk to our doctoral students about this, is that when you're working with theory, often it's a scary thing, but when you're working with theory, it's something that you want to use, borrow, poach, steal, take aspects from. And critical demography had been used a couple of times in the social studies itself. But it was looking at one of the articles was looking at teacher educators and the shift in teacher educators demographic makeup. But it was used in a way that it was kind of thrown in there. If you throw the word critical in social studies, then everybody thinks that they love it. But it didn't actually go all the way through. They didn't use it very well as a way to align with the findings and the data. And so each kind of playful thing we've done with demography, place attachment, and critical place inquiry, we tried to go back to the kind of initial sources around critical demography, or go back to geographers or people where we'll go out of our literature to try and bring it in for it to follow through. So when we say that this study is informed by critical demography, what we mean that we're not treating demographic data as simple and neutral description, like Amy said. And what you see with Ortega's framework, it's helpful because it shows that demography is part of a larger cycle of institutional and discursive powers. In the diagram, state and other institutions shape populations through policy. Those populations are then measured through data collection, turned into data sources, and then kind of made legible and translated into analysis of outputs by agencies, researchers, and institutions. But the process doesn't stop there. These outputs then circulate back into policy, institutional practice, and public understanding of who populations are. So in other words, data doesn't just simply describe the world, it helps shape it. It organizes how the world is seen and then how it's governed. So this matters for our study because categories such as rural, teacher, race, certification pathways, or school poverty level are then not natural or self-explanatory. They're institutional categories that make some realities visible while hiding or obscuring others. So a critical demographic perspective encourages us to not only ask what the numbers show, but then how those numbers are produced and then what assumptions travel with them and what they may flatten or hide. So rather than reading kind of the findings as this transparent portrait of just rural social studies, white, we read them as partial but important representation shaped by broader systems of like schooling, policy, and data connection. And that's why we think it does kind of connect with both first rural, second rural, and rural plural. It helps kind of for first rural, like Amy was saying, it brings and makes familiar the stereotypes of rural America as white, homogeneous, isolated, traditional, and static. And that's often the dominant image as we go type of thing. So yeah, that's the diagram.
You kind of gave away the findings there when you said rural social studies, white. So
Well,
that
you
this
know
is
what? I
preview. It's
actually
just
have a
foreshadowing.
feeling. I
It's
have
fine.
a feeling it's like watching the Titanic. They're not going to be shocked when it sinks,
That's fair.
you
That's really
know?
fair.
So
Okay. All right. So that's a little bit, that's the first layer, critical demography and first rural. Our second layer is thinking about ideas of place attachment and rural teacher identity. And we paired that with the idea of second rural. So, place attachment can be defined as the emotional link formed by an individual to a physical site that has been given meaning through interaction. So, it's this movement from abstract notions of space to a meaningful place. In other words, a space becomes a place when it is known, experienced, and infused with value. This lens really provides the opportunity to help us make sense of why teachers whose racial, linguistic, gender, sociocultural, or political identities differ from dominant communities may experience professional alienation or struggle to develop meaningful attachments to place. And it also helps us think about the way that professional identities are shaped by embeddedness, community belonging, and the local cultural and political landscapes. And this one aligns with second rural, which is defined as the symbolic, effective, and socially constructed meanings attached to rural life.
And I'd
And
just like to jump in. Can I just jump in
yeah,
on place
please.
attachment theory? It comes out of actually symbolic interactionism. And again, what we've kind of done is we went into Milligan's work, and she actually basically studied it in a coffee shop and developed this theory, which is really about past and present potentials, and how you look towards the future. So again, it was meant as a kind of a playful way for us to help understand the data that we're moving with. So when you start taking kind of critical demography, connecting it with place attachment theory, and then trying to adapt it and borrow aspects from Milligan, we're hopefully that we can carry that through with the rest of the data as we go.
Okay. And then our final lens that we're thinking about is critical place inquiry as an interpretive and methodological bridge. And we have paired this with the idea of rural plural. So, critical place inquiry is any form of empirical research that collects place-specific data, draws on these explicitly during data analysis, and/or generates insights that speak back to the role of place in answering research questions in education-related studies. So we use this here to understand how race, space, and institutional practice co-construct the meaning of rural education, but then also as a theoretical opportunity to engage with the racialized and ideological dimensions of where teachers teach. And that kind of allows us to trace how rurality and whiteness are institutional at a national level. And the rural plural lens provides this sort of analytical bridge between federal classifications of place, first rural, that's where we're talking about that definition that we're using that is provided by IES, and then the lived symbolic experiences of rurality, which is the second rural. Okay, so now we're going to jump into what our findings are. And again, remember I said that we're using both data from 2017 and 18, and then sort of comparing that to data from 2020 to 2021, which is the most recently available data from this survey. So on this table, I'm going to kind of be going back and forth. This is the 17-18 data, and then this is the 2021 data, and I'll be talking about both of them. But you will be able to get a copy of these slides if you'd like to see, or also we have a QR code at the end that links to this article if you want to see the full study. So we want to start by just sharing that approximately 22.1% of social studies teachers in the U.S. work in rural areas. So when we're thinking about who we're talking about 22% of the population of social studies teachers. Between 2017, 18, and 2020, 2021, we saw a gradual increase in the percentage of rural teachers in the disciplines that we've considered here. So we have social studies, general, economics, civics, geography, history. And this finding may speak to the growth of rural communities. These numbers have increased slightly over the 5 years considered in this study. And again, I just lost. Oh, we're just highlighting specific findings here. So I'm not going to talk about every number that's on here. I'm just going to highlight some of the things that we connected to in our discussion. Um, a substantial number of rural social studies teachers responding to this national survey were non-Hispanic white. Over 90% of social studies in the field at large and in each respective social studies discipline. So that is a very, large percentage. Roughly two-thirds of civics or government teachers are male, which we thought was an interesting finding. Roughly two-thirds of geography teachers are female. The percentage of social studies teachers reporting that they are non-Hispanic white actually increased between 1718 and 2021. So we see that here it was 90.8, and then in 2020, 2021, it went up to 93.5. And that kind of challenges the idea that, like, well, we'll get into that in the discussion. I'll save that for a minute. It also, the data that we have here kind of highlights how rural areas are largely untouched by demographic shifts in the teaching force. So despite this idea that there's been broad efforts to diversify the field, we're actually not seeing any of that in these rural spaces. Also, interesting finding, the mean for years of teaching experience in 2020 to 2021 is between 13 years and 19 years, and that is higher than it was in 2017, 2018. On this chart, they've been in the field between 11 and 15 years to 13 and 19 years. And we found that to be an interesting finding as well, because we were wondering, well, it could just mean that this is 5 years later, so there's more people in the field, right? But this data also, the 2021 data came out right after COVID. So is it saying something about how many teachers chose to stay in the field post-COVID, and maybe teachers who had more longevity stayed longer? Or maybe that's not there at all, right? We're having to make some assumptions. And so I think even just in listening to me talk about this, you can see how the data is not neutral. Like, right, we're having to interpret it and make some assumptions. But it may also indicate that veteran social studies teachers now make up a larger portion of teachers in rural areas, at least as of 2021. David, do you want to add anything to that chart?
No, it's just numbers. And I basically do qualitative work. And so I just see lots of numbers.
Okay.
And I'm now feeling really bad that I've just ruined the film The Titanic for people. So I'm having a bit of an existential crisis here. So if you could carry on with the numbers, yeah. And I'm not
Okay,
going to
perfect.
mention anything about JFK, the film. I don't want to
Okay,
ruin that for
perfect.
anybody.
Great. Okay. So then our next table that we had and our next research question was, what type of program did social studies teachers complete? And you can see from this chart, on this chart, we have both sets of data on the same. So 2017-18 is at the top, 2020-2021 is at the bottom. And we can see that approximately 48% or more of rural social studies educators have advanced degrees, with two-thirds of civics or government teachers having advanced degrees. Around 80% come from traditional programs, with approximately 90% being fully certified. But again, there's an exception for civic or government educators, which is slightly lower. A higher percentage, just over a third, come from alternative programs, and only 84.7 report being fully certified. Outside of civics, the number of teachers with advanced degrees is trending downwards from the percentages reported in 2017, 2018. I won't even ask this time if you want to add anything. I'm just going to keep going. Okay. And then our last question was, how satisfied are they with their employment? And again, I'm not going to read everything that's on this slide, but I'm just going to highlight a few things. So it's interesting, when asked about stress and disappointment, few teachers, one-third or less in most categories, felt like the stress and disappointments involved in teaching at their present school were not really worth it. But despite this, less than a third of them reported thinking about transferring to another school during 2020-2021, and more than two-thirds of teachers reported that they liked the way their school was being run in 2020-2021. Additionally, in three disciplines, social studies, civics or government, and history, more than 80% of teachers reporting said they would describe teachers at their school as a satisfied group. But despite this, 1/3 to half of teachers suggest they would leave their current school or even the field as a whole for a higher paying job. And then we also see teachers self-reporting high levels of satisfaction. So that is some of the findings that we're just going to highlight. And now we're going to move into talking about what we think they mean. But first, we're going to start with why does this matter for social studies? So before we start the interpretation, we thought it would be helpful to just go back to why is this important? And we had 2 points in this category. So really, the first one is understanding who teaches social studies in rural communities matters because of the civic mission of the discipline. And then also because these teachers operate at the intersection of racialized space, demographic change, and ideological scrutiny. And what we're really getting at when we say that is it matters a lot for social studies because of what is being taught in social studies. When you are teaching students how to be a citizen and you don't see your history or yourself reflected in the teachers or in the curriculum or in what's being prioritized, then that creates a really big mismatch between students' identities and teachers' identities. And so that's unique to the field of social studies because of the focus that it has um, on student identity and this idea of citizenship. And so that, I mean, that links to the second point here, which is when social studies is taught in increasingly diverse classrooms by an overwhelmingly white teaching force, that mismatch has consequence for curriculum, for community relationships, and for students' sense of belonging in civic life. We're back to words. Do you want to add anything here?
Yeah, one of the thing is that it's in the other paper really, but we are looking there in percentage of students who are non-white in social studies rural classrooms is like 28%, and it's becoming increasingly diverse. So I think having that background to connect to this becomes really important. That the student body is becoming more diverse, even if the teachers are not. And then we're also it gets more and more kind of acute an issue or more concerning as you go when you look at this data and its stability based on the in the current era, the idea of divisive concepts and the ideological splits that are occurring are even more marked at the moment. And this concept of the white social studies, how it's pervading, is a concern for teacher educators and for teachers, and for thinking about what it means to actually uh, have a discipline that is supposed to be teaching all students about, the conflict and divisiveness that actually is the base of what American history is. It was founded upon conflict itself.
Okay, so with all that in mind, then we're going to go into our interpretation using our lenses to talk about what we think that data means. So the first section of our findings, we talk about the persistence of homogeneity in rural teacher demographics, which is back to they're, rural social studies teachers, they're all white. So the continuity of whiteness in the rural teaching force, we feel like reflects not only representational gaps, but also structural exclusions. So certification pathways, hiring practices, and teacher education programs continue to reflect a racialized logic that sorts white teachers into rural spaces and limits access for others. And these rural teacher demographics reflect both the first rural, so geographic spaces and places alongside low population density, and second rural, the lived meanings of tradition, safety, and identity. It's not simply that rural teachers are mostly white, it's that whiteness is often expected, centered, and reproduced through policy, culture, and hiring practices. From this vantage point, the demographic profile of rural social studies teachers is not incidental. It is the product of structures that define who belongs, who teaches, and what civic learning looks like in rural spaces. And this actually matches up with another theory that we've been looking at recently, which is not in this paper, but it positions whiteness as a credential. And so it's almost like looking at some of these statistics and some of the ways that these demographics play out. It is almost like being white is enough sometimes to be in these spaces.
Yeah, and it's called Theory of Racialized Organizations by Ray, and it does offer some. We've come to that theory late, and it would have probably been laid into this paper, but it really, as a lens, theory of racialized organizations, um, there's such resonance in it. It's got a number of tenets, and one is white as credentialed. It's really kind of very powerful as a way of thinking about it. I think one thing to add is we were very careful in the paper, though, where it talks about certification pathways between traditional and alternative. And one thing we made clear is that alternative did not mean less than, but it was, these traditional pathways, alternative pathways. We were not getting into the weeds with regard which is better or not. We were just reporting uh, who's taking which pathways as you go.
Right. The second section in our discussion was about rural sense of belonging and community change. So, as we just said, generally rural social studies teachers report that they like their job. We see evidence of job satisfaction as this data shows many rural social studies teachers stay embedded in their school community for extended periods of time. So that, up to 19 years average of how long someone has been in the field. Leaning into place attachment and second rural, we interpret this pattern as evidence of symbolic and effective alignment between teachers and their communities. So, teachers embedded in shared cultural norms may experience strong place attachment, contributing to their persistence in the profession. However, it could also go the opposite way, right? Such attachments can also signal insularity. So, place attachment may signal alignment with dominant racial and ideological norms, and this would suggest that teachers of color or those whose identities do not align with the community may experience alienation not captured in aggregate satisfaction metrics. So there's things that we can't say, but we can maybe assume based on this data. And with that same theme, we also noted, like David was saying a minute ago, there are shifting demographics of students in rural communities. So the students there are becoming more diverse, and that is in the other paper. But given these shifting dynamics, professional development that equips rural social studies teachers to develop their understanding of what it means to prepare future citizens within an increasingly diverse nation becomes more important. As the number of students of color increases in many historically white communities, teachers should develop culturally responsive teaching practices and be open to new ways of engaging all students, including students of color, in the school community without othering them. And in some of the literature that we've been reading since we wrote this paper more recently, one of the things that has really stood out to us is the solution doesn't necessarily have to be that there is that there are more teachers of color. That's a great solution. But part of the solution also needs to be for teacher educators like ourselves to make sure that teachers are prepared to go into those communities and understand the context that they're teaching in, understand the students who are there, and lean into things like culturally responsive teaching in meaningful ways instead of in surface or shallow ways. And then our other sort of conclusion here is that we see that the stability of teacher qualifications and certifications signals alignments with dominant professional expectations. And this might be rooted in both first rural material realities and second rural ideological narratives about who rural teachers are. Through a rural plural lens, longevity can be read as further evidence of cultural alignment with whiteness as the normative presence in rural social studies education. All right. And then the final section that we had in the paper in the discussion was about critical place inquiry and the problem of white social studies. And this really gets back to why we were saying, why does this matter for social studies specifically? The persistence of whiteness in the rural teaching force is not only a product of who applies or who stays, but of the cultural and institutional ways of thinking that define what it means to be a good rural social studies teacher. White social studies is often not just a demographic outcome, but a curricular one, intentionally reproduced through silence, avoidance, and pressures to preserve hegemonic whiteness. When interpreted through the rural plural lens, the result is a professional landscape in which white social studies becomes the default, not only in who teaches, but in what histories are taught, whose civic identities are centered, and how belonging is defined. And I guess we didn't really define white social studies, and maybe, I don't know everybody in the audience, maybe that would be helpful. But I mean, when we're thinking about white social studies, we're really talking mostly about like the dominant narrative of more traditional story of the US that doesn't incorporate diverse perspectives or really think about the ways that minorities have contributed to the uh, foundation of the country.
Yeah, it's often been referred to almost like a quest for freedom narrative. That was done by James Versh, which is the idea that when you look at US history, it's all about improvement and progress. And what happens is that the different populations or different groups appear at certain times in history, and it's often around success or a fight making some achievements. But the concept of struggle is often lost, and the kind of systemic inequalities kind of are left opaque and hidden based on the quest for freedom narrative of American history that is often then very predominantly white orientated. And then when you get things like the civil rights movement, you don't learn about the long civil rights movement. You learn about, Brown versus Board, end of story, success, done, we fixed it, type of thing, rather than a longer view and a more even current view.
And when non-white teachers go into schools and they're asked to teach those narratives or those are the norms in the building, then it does create this sort of mismatch between who they are and who they see, and students as well, but like who they are and what they're being asked to teach. And so that's kind of some of what we're talking about here when we're thinking about what civic identities are being prioritized, and how teachers can feel uncomfortable. Non-white teachers can feel uncomfortable in that setting, and they don't always stay because of that.
And what we've also seen is this, it's almost like a double bind at times where you will get the idea of, well, let's have some diversity work, or let's do some professional development on diversity, or we'll do it in teacher education and we'll have a class on kind of CRT or inclusion. And, the students can pay lip service to it. And give a nod, but it actually doesn't mean that anything's actually going to change within their actual classrooms because it's such a short kind of experience itself. And by paying lip service, then you go back into the schools and you tap into your own biographic conceptions of what history or social studies was. You become a teacher because you want to often teach like you were taught, and that's a challenge.
So all of this, as we were thinking about this presentation and what we really wanted to share, we wanted to sort of leave with some of the like implications for practice. And we thought a good way to do that would be to return to the other article that we've written that was really for a practitioner-facing journal. And so this is one of the other articles that we wrote. It's David introduced that at the beginning, and these are the research questions that we addressed there. But we really did a really large focus here on professional development. In the 1718 survey, what types of professional development did they receive was one of the categories of questions. And that's not a question that's done every year. It wasn't in the 2021 data, so we couldn't look at it further. But we want to talk about that a little bit now.
Yeah, and part of this is a relatively new journal, Annals of Social
Annals.
Studies. Oh, thank God.
Yeah.
Annals of Social Studies Education Research for Teachers. And what it basically seeks to do, and why it's relatively unique, is you present some research or you present the work you're doing, but then it goes to a teacher educator or maybe an academic, but it also gets reviewed by teachers, and then questions are asked. So part of the article is actually not just what you've written. You have to then respond to some of the questions. And I thought what we do here basically is just kind of share some of the questions and some of the areas that we went to. So when we presented that, and you've seen a lot of the data already, this paper was basically focusing on the 2017, 2018 data. But we were kind of then saying, well, what does this mean for teacher educators and teachers when how to prepare teachers for rural social studies, how to support teachers in rural social studies. And at times, I mean, it might still feel a little trite and things, but one of the things that we came away with was trying to look at our own practices and what we lean into to kind of push against the white social studies. So what materials out there that are relatively strong and offer different perspectives that teachers could tap into. So part of what we created was a kind of a table of just resources around maybe equity, literacy, facing history, facing ourselves is a very powerful online educational resource. We also looked at teaching with primary sources, the importance of if you can teach with sources and standards, that can save you from standard sources and student questions can actually save you from community anxiety when you're investigating, say, the causes of the Civil War, just say slavery. But the idea there is there's so many sources that kind of actually basically say that Alexander Stevens' cornerstone speech says it was about slavery because blacks are inferior and we are a new race, we are the white race and we are going to be in control. And then you get the South Carolina secession document and you can work with those kind of documents. And teaching with primary sources has some very powerful materials there. We also talked about the Right Question Institute, where you can actually just have students engaging with building their own questions based on primary sources. So there's a whole strategy there about students asking questions of sources themselves and then teachers tapping into those questions to build materials as you go. So we really kind of spent a lot of time talking about, based on this data, what kind of things are we doing in teacher education, but what kind of things would we encourage teachers to work with? And then we get the questions after we've submitted this paper and we think, oh yeah, we've done a good job, nice job. We're then given teacher questions who've looked at it and then we're asked to respond. So the first question, which was kind of pretty good actually, was right. You rightly point out the discrepancy between teacher and student demographics. What specific opportunities does that gap create for using digital and accessible resources found in table 7, which is the table that we've put in front of you? So then we have to think about those questions and how we're going to answer them, type of thing. And so one of our messages there was, yeah, we can't just throw kind of resources at you. So this is not just a resource list per se. It's the idea of these have been curated. They are free, high quality, open educational resources. And they are an invitation to rethink whose histories, perspectives, and civic experiences are centered in the classrooms. So for us, when we're offering this and working with teachers, it's the idea of trying to facilitate teachers to learn deeply about the students in front of them, look at the students in front of them, their lives, their communities, and their histories, and then pick resources that widen the conversation rather than narrow it or align with just what they want to hear. So we also want to be careful here that not every kind of thing that there is accessible online is a good one, maybe. But the list in the articles is meant to help teachers begin to build a professional library of trustworthy sources that can support stronger, more inclusive and more thoughtful social studies. So the idea of being able to rely on some initial high quality ones is what we did. Then we can see the other questions that teachers were asking us are based on our research. So question 2 was, the job satisfaction indicator, I don't have much enthusiasm, on table 4 is interesting because nearly half of the teachers reported losing enthusiasm and the mean age and experience suggests there are mid-career teachers. How can rural teachers facing the feeling of loss of enthusiasm regain their passions for the job given the implications that you described, type of thing? And so we were kind of there, we were like, well, I think this question resonates with lots of teachers because it's named something real that you get tired, type of thing. What stood out for us in the data is that the teachers often still reported being satisfied in their schools, though, even though they did not feel quite as enthusiastic as when they first began. That's an important distinction. We do not read the data as showing a profession in collapse. Instead, we see teachers who are still committed, but who may need to have renewed support, recognition, and connections. The research we drew on suggests that teachers stay where they feel tight to students, respected by leaders, connected to colleagues, and embedded in the community. So the answer is not simply work harder, be more positive. It's about creating conditions still where teachers can reconnect with purpose, with one another, and with reasons they entered the profession in the first place. So we were trying to think about making sense of the data as we go, and that this idea of data gets quite complex around satisfaction and enthusiasm, and it hits and levels of sustainability. The other questions that we received about this type of work was question 3 was, over the past half century, rural areas have been seen a decrease in economic activity, population, and resources. Likewise, they've been ravaged by the opioid epidemic and suffer from severe generational poverty. Some of the poorest areas with some of the fewest resources are rural. What role should student poverty play in considering the type of professional development offered to social studies teachers? And we weren't expecting these questions. And I think the reason why I wanted to share these with you is that they are really pushing and hard questions that, you know, you don't want to necessarily give a trite response, but the questions themselves were powerful unto themselves. Our response at that stage was, this is an important question because rural poverty is real. And it can be talked about in ways that flatten communities or reduce students to just deficits. Our response is that poverty absolutely matters. It has to be understood in context of, in relation to other dimensions of identity and inequality. And in the article, we note that the percentage identified as high poverty depends partly on how poverty is defined, but that does not mean the issue is minor. It means that teachers need professional development that helps them read their communities again carefully and respond with nuance. For us, that does really stress equity literacy. Teachers and kind of the work of Paul Gorski there, and teachers need support in recognizing how class, race, disability, language, and geography intersect, and then in designing and thinking about curriculum and pedagogy in response to those realities without kind of pathologizing rural young people.
And really that goes back to what we were talking about previously about how context really matters. So
Yeah.
it's not just about the race question, but even about the poverty question. Like how are we, for us, preparing teacher educators to go into settings where this is the context, especially when they're not coming from those communities, they're not familiar with those communities.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. And then question 4 was, how can place-based learning, professional development help social studies teachers serve their minority and low economic students? And, again, I think one of the things there was that one of the strongest things, we would say here is that place-based learning matters. And I think, it helps shift the conversation from deficit to possibility. Too often rural communities, are described in terms of what they lack. Place-based work asks a different question, where histories, relationships, cultural traditions, and new cultures, can appear, and these resources there. And I think that matters enormously for students to see that whose identities may be marginalized by race and class. It becomes a place of importance of where they live now, and a sense of communities are worth studying. And so we were talking there about giving examples of communities where oral histories, community archives, local mapping, local industry studies, and tools like one of my favorite is called History Pin, can serve as spaces that allow kids and teachers to talk about communities in different ways and show change or continuity over time. History Pin is a really lovely site that uses kind of Street View, Google Street View, and you can put old images and oral histories and sources in the places where they were talked about, and you can layer those in, and it can be curated by students to talk about where they come from, what their communities look like, and you can also put future plans in. So what does the future look like as you go? So we do feel like things like that, that kind of work can help students see that local history is not separate from national and global. And so place matters, and it can be attached to the larger stories, and they can become visible. The final question that was asked to us was, evidence and research-based professional development are important in education, but the availability of potential resources can be overwhelming. And we had a table that was overwhelming. But what strategies would you recommend for social studies teachers to sift through these resources to focus on practices with greatest potential? And I think one of the things there for many teachers is that, there might be no shortages of stuff, but there is shortages of time, trust, and clarity. And so where we were going there was, in our response, was you've got to start small and curate intentionally. Work with college, build a professional library, use professional organizations, but do not assume that because something's popular, it's worthwhile to use, and give yourself permission to drop in and drop out of resources that don't work for you. We also, again, encourage teachers to look for resources that kind of fit the community, fit the context, but also allowed for a broader, expansive view as you go. So in other words, the goal is not to consume everything. The goal is to actually kind of pick carefully And we mentioned a couple of things there with regard to how to evaluate online sources as you go. So what I appreciate about these questions, though, is that they push the study beyond description, right? They ask what that data means for actual teachers working in rural schools, and for us, that kept the conversation going. And having to really think about not just what it shows and make inferences, but what it means for our practice and how it shapes our practice as we move forward as well.
Great. So that's everything that we sort of have prepared for today. We have about 10 minutes left, and I think the chat feature is disabled, but there is a Q&A option. So if you have questions for us, we're happy to stick around and answer questions. But that's our presentation. And thank you everyone for coming. I think that if you attended, I think you'll be able to get a copy of the recording, and then we'll also share these slides with Dr. Azana so she can send them out to people who attended as well.
Yeah, that's good. And again, really sorry about spoiling the Titanic film. It was a bit of a shock to me. So I don't know why, but yeah.
All right, thank you.
Bye now.